Amelia Bones could have left the office an hour ago. The stack of files on her desk had dwindled to 3, and even those were routine follow-ups on Death Eater arrests that barely required her attention as head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. The war was over, had been over since yesterday, when news arrived that the Dark Lord had fallen at Godric's Hollow. She could have gone home to Susan, could have held her niece close and pretended that the world was finally safe again. But the silence in Level 2 felt wrong, too sudden after months of frantic activity, emergency meetings, and sleepless nights coordinating aura strikes. The absence of crisis left a hollow space that Amelia wasn't ready to fill with relief. Not yet. Not when Edgar was still cold in the ground, along with his wife and children. Not when the cells beneath the ministry still echoed with the screams of prisoners under questioning. She picked up the topmost file, Rabaston Lestrange, captured 3 days ago trying to flee the country. The parchment crackled between her fingers as she read Moody's report for the 3rd time, though the words might as well have been gibberish. Her mind kept drifting to the morning's other news. Sirius Black, arrested for betraying the Potters and murdering 12 muggles in broad daylight. James Potter's best friend, the man who had stood beside him at order meetings, who had laughed at Lily's jokes and promised to be godfather to their son. The man who had apparently sold them to Voldemort for reasons no one could fathom. A sharp knock interrupted her brooding. "Enter," she called, straightening in her chair and forcing her expression into something resembling professional composure. The door opened to admit a thin wizard in expensive robes, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the late hour. Amelia recognized him immediately. Septimus Clearwater, one of London's most prominent magical solicitors. He carried a briefcase of dark dragonhide and wore the careful neutral expression that meant either very good news or very bad news for someone. "Madam Bones," he said, inclining his head respectfully. "I apologize for calling so late, but the matter is rather urgent. Mr. Clearwater." Amelia gestured to the chair across from her desk. "I wasn't aware we had business pending." "We don't, precisely." Clearwater settled himself with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to delivering momentous information. I represented, the estate of James and Lily Potter." Amelia's quill, which had been moving absently across a form, stopped mid-stroke. She set it down carefully. "I see. Mrs. Potter came to see me last month. She wished to update their will, given the circumstances with the war and their concerns about their son's safety." Clearwater opened his briefcase with practiced efficiency, withdrawing a scroll sealed with red wax. The will was signed and witnessed on the 15th of October. I had hoped, naturally, that it would never need to be executed. The parchment seemed to occupy all the space between them as Clearwater placed it on her desk. Amelia stared at the seal, a stylized phoenix with wings spread wide, surrounded by words in Latin she didn't recognize. Lily's personal seal, then, not the Potter family crest. "I'm not sure why you've brought this to me," Amelia said slowly, though something cold was beginning to unfurl in her stomach. "Surely young Harry has been placed with family already." "Indeed. That is precisely the problem." Clearwater's voice remained professionally neutral, but Amelia caught a note of disapproval beneath the surface. "The boy was placed with his mother's sister this morning, by order of Chief Warlock Dumbledore. However, Mrs. Potter's will contains very specific instructions regarding guardianship that were not consulted before this placement was made." Amelia reached for the scroll, then hesitated. Whatever was written inside would change things. She could feel the weight of pending responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak, and part of her, the part that had buried too many friends, signed too many death certificates, held her 1-year-old niece while Susan wept for parents she would never remember, wanted to tell Clearwater to take his documents and leave. But Edgar would have opened it without hesitation. Edgar had never walked away from a child in need, even when it cost him everything. "May I?" she asked, though her fingers were already breaking the seal. The parchment unrolled smoothly, revealing Lily Potter's neat script in midnight blue ink. Amelia's eyes skipped over the formal language, bequests to friends, instructions for the family vault, until she found the section that mattered. "In the event of our deaths, while our son, Harry James Potter, remains a minor, we name Sirius Orion Black as his primary guardian, trusting in his love for our son and his commitment to raising Harry with knowledge of both his magical heritage and his parents' values." Amelia's breath caught. She forced herself to keep reading. "Should Sirius Black be unable or unwilling to serve as guardian for any reason, we name Amelia Susan Bones as secondary guardian. We make this appointment in recognition of her dedication to justice, her strength of character, and her understanding of the costs of standing against darkness. We trust her to protect our son and guide him wisely." The scroll slipped from Amelia's suddenly nerveless fingers. She stared at Clearwater, who was watching her reaction with the detached interest of a man accustomed to upending people's lives. "Sirius Black is in Azkaban," she said faintly. "Precisely. Which brings the guardianship to you, as named in the will." Clearwater leaned forward slightly. "I should note that Mrs. Potter was quite specific about this arrangement. She mentioned having worked with you during several order operations and expressed particular respect for your integrity." Amelia tried to remember when she had spoken with Lily Potter for more than a few minutes at a time. There had been meetings, certainly. The order's coordination required input from the DMLE when possible, but they had hardly been close friends. Why would Lily choose her over Alice Longbottom, or any number of other order members? Unless Lily had known something would happen to the others. Unless she had looked ahead and seen the aftermath of war with the same clarity that had made her such a formidable witch in battle. "What of the boy's aunt?" Amelia asked. "Surely his blood relatives have a claim." "Blood relationship establishes no legal right to guardianship when a will exists," Clearwater replied crisply. "The placement with Mrs. Dursley appears to have been made without consulting the proper documentation. Entirely irregular, I'm afraid." Amelia thought of Susan, asleep in her crib at home with her stuffed dragon clutched against her chest. Susan, who had lost her own parents barely 2 months ago, and was only just beginning to sleep through the night without crying. How could she bring another traumatized child into their small, fragile household? How could she take on responsibility for the boy who lived? Because that was what they were calling him now. She had heard the whispers when she was barely managing to care for one bereaved infant. But how could she walk away? "I'll need to see him," she said quietly. Clearwater blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Harry Potter. I'll need to see him before I make any decisions." Amelia stood, her chair scraping against the stone floor. "If I'm to become responsible for a child's welfare, I should at least meet him first." "Of course." Clearwater was already packing the will back into his briefcase with efficient movements. "I can arrange a meeting with the current guardians tomorrow. If you— Tonight!" The word came out sharper than Amelia had intended. She softened her tone, but not her resolve. If this guardianship transfer is to happen, it should happen quickly. The boy shouldn't be left to form attachments with people who can't keep him. It wasn't entirely true. Her decision had less to do with Harry's emotional welfare than with her own sudden, fierce certainty that she couldn't leave James and Lily's son with people who hadn't chosen to take him in. The Dursleys were strangers, thrust into an impossible situation. She, at least, had been selected. Clearwater nodded slowly. Very well. Privet Drive in Little Whinging, Surrey. Number 4. I can meet you there within the hour. After he left, Amelia remained standing beside her desk, staring at the place where the will had lain. The files that had seemed so important an hour ago now looked like relics from another life. Edgar's voice seemed to whisper in her memory. You can't save everyone, Amelia, but you can save the ones in front of you. She reached for her travelling cloak and tried not to think about what she would tell Susan when she came home with another orphaned child. Some explanations would have to wait until morning. Some explanations might take years. The December morning was grey and bitter, with frost coating the windows of Amelia's study as she waited for Arthur Weasley to arrive. She had chosen Arthur specifically for this consultation, not because he was the Ministry's most senior expert on protective magic, but because she trusted his discretion and his genuine concern for children's welfare. The fewer people who knew about Harry Potter's change in guardianship, the better. Susan sat on the carpet near Amelia's feet, methodically tearing apart a picture book with the focused determination that 1-year-olds brought to destruction. Harry lay on his back beside her, staring up at the ceiling with those startlingly green eyes that were so much like his mother's. A month of living in the same house had not yet made the children friends. They were too young for friendship, but they had achieved a sort of parallel comfort in each other's presence. The Floo connection chimed, and Arthur's head appeared among the green flames, his red hair dishevelled as always. Amelia, I'm here for our appointment. Come through, she called, moving Harry to her lap, as Arthur stepped out of the fireplace, brushing soot from his robes. Good morning, Arthur said, his expression growing more serious as he took in the scene. His eyes lingered on Harry for a moment. Everyone did that, searching for signs of the magic that had saved him, before returning to Amelia. You mentioned you needed advice on protective magic for children. I brought some reference materials. Thank you. Please, sit. Amelia gestured to the chair across from her desk, while Harry grabbed at her quill with tiny, determined fingers. I need to understand the mechanics of blood protection magic. Arthur's eyebrows rose. That's quite specific. May I ask why? Amelia had rehearsed this conversation, but the words still felt awkward in her mouth. I've recently taken guardianship of a child whose mother died protecting him. There are concerns about whether removing him from his blood relatives might compromise certain magical protections. It wasn't entirely a lie, though it wasn't entirely the truth either. Arthur nodded thoughtfully, apparently accepting the carefully neutral phrasing. Blood magic is complex, he said, settling into his chair. The protection you're referring to, it's based on willing sacrifice, isn't it? The mother died to save her child? Yes. Then the magic would have anchored itself to the child, but it requires a specific environment to remain active. Arthur pulled a slim volume from his bag, flipping through pages covered with diagrams and runic symbols. The protection needs to be reinforced by familial love, not necessarily blood relation, but the emotional resonance that comes from genuine care and acceptance. Amelia felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. So the blood relationship itself isn't crucial. Not as crucial as most people believe. The magic looks for love, for the willingness to die for the child, just as the mother did. If that exists, Arthur shrugged. The protection can adapt. It might be different, perhaps not as strong in some ways, but it won't simply vanish. Harry had managed to capture the quill and was now trying to eat the feather. Amelia gently extracted it from his grip, earning a look of profound betrayal from those green eyes. What about external threats, if someone wanted to harm the child? The original sacrifice creates a barrier against those who mean harm, particularly the one who killed the mother. But it's not invincible. Arthur's voice grew more serious. The protection is strongest where the child is most loved, most truly at home. That's why blood relatives are traditionally preferred. There's an assumption of natural affection. An assumption that isn't always correct. No, it isn't. Arthur closed the book, studying Amelia's face. May I ask about the child's current situation? Are there concerns about the previous guardians? Amelia bounced Harry gently on her knee, buying time to consider how much to reveal. The boy gurgled happily, apparently forgetting his disappointment about the quill. Let's say the previous arrangement was made hastily, without full consideration of the child's emotional needs. Arthur nodded slowly. I see. Well, if you're providing a loving home, and from what I can see, you are, then the magic will recognize that. It might take time to fully settle into the new environment, but children are remarkably adaptable. A soft chiming from the hallway interrupted their conversation. Amelia frowned. She wasn't expecting any other visitors. "Excuse me," she said, rising and settling Harry into Arthur's surprised arms. "I should see who that is." The chiming came from the ward detection spell she had installed last week, keyed to alert her whenever someone approached with urgent ministry business. She found Kingsley Shacklebolt on her doorstep, his dark face grave with bad news. "Amelia," he said without preamble. "I'm sorry to disturb you at home, but there's been an incident. Frank and Alice Longbottom were attacked last night." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What do you mean? Attacked? The war is over. Death Eaters. 4 of them. The Lestranges, young Crouch, and one other we haven't identified yet." Kingsley's voice was carefully controlled, but she could hear the anger underneath. They were looking for information about Voldemort's whereabouts. When Frank and Alice couldn't tell them anything, how badly are they hurt? But even as she asked, Amelia could read the answer in Kingsley's expression. "The healers say they'll live. But the Cruciatus curse," he shook his head. "They're at St. Mungo's, in the long-term care ward. The damage to their minds is extensive." Amelia leaned against the doorframe, feeling suddenly dizzy. Frank and Alice had been so young, barely out of Hogwarts when the war began. Their son Neville was only a few months older than Harry, still sleeping peacefully in his cot while his parents lay broken in a hospital bed. "We'll catch them," Kingsley said quietly. "Moody's already leading the investigation. But I thought you should know immediately, given your position." "Yes. Thank you." The words felt inadequate. But what else could she say? Another family destroyed. Another child left without parents. At least Neville would have his grandmother. At least he wouldn't be alone. She returned to the study to find Arthur bouncing Harry on his knee while Susan chewed on his shoelaces. Both children seemed entirely content with this arrangement. "Bad news?" Arthur asked, taking in her expression. "The worst." Amelia sank into her chair, suddenly grateful for the normal domestic chaos around her. "Frank and Alice Longbottom were tortured by Death Eaters last night. They won't recover." Arthur went very still. "My God, but I thought—" "So did we all." She reached for Harry, needing to hold him close. The boy settled against her shoulder with the trusting weight of complete security, unaware of the violence that had shaped his world. "The war might be over, but the hatred isn't." They sat in silence for a moment, watching Susan systematically destroy Arthur's shoelaces. Finally, Arthur spoke. "About the protective magic we discussed," he said carefully. given what just happened to the Longbottoms, I'd say keeping the child somewhere safe and loved is more important than worrying about the precise mechanics of blood magic. Amelia nodded, her decision crystallizing into something firm and unshakable. I'll need stronger wards on the house, not just the standard protections, something that could withstand a determined assault. I can arrange that. Bill Weasley is our best curse breaker, and he's just returned from Egypt. He could design something. Arthur paused. This wouldn't be for Harry Potter, would it? She met his eyes steadily. Does it matter? No, Arthur said, after a moment. I suppose it doesn't. Every child deserves protection. That afternoon, while Harry napped and Susan played with blocks that were too advanced for her, but which she attacked with characteristic determination, Amelia walked through her house with new eyes. The sitting room with its comfortable chairs and warm fireplace, the kitchen where she had learned to cook simple meals that wouldn't frighten a traumatized child, the spare bedroom she had converted into a nursery, with 2 cribs positioned so the children could see each other when they woke. It wasn't a fortress, but it was becoming a home, the kind of place where children could grow up feeling safe, even when the world outside remained dangerous. Bill Weasley arrived that evening, a tall young man with dragon-hide gloves and the easy confidence of someone accustomed to dismantling ancient curses. He spent an hour walking the perimeter of the house, occasionally pausing to sketch runes in a leather-bound notebook. The foundation is good, he told Amelia as they stood in her garden, watching the winter stars emerge. The house itself has protective qualities, something about the family magic, maybe, or just the accumulated love of generations. I can layer additional protections on top of that. Warning charms, deflection barriers, maybe something to confuse the location for anyone looking with hostile intent. How long will it take? 3 days, maybe 4. I'll need to work mostly at night. Some of these spells don't react well to daylight. Bill glanced toward the house, where warm light spilled from the kitchen windows. The children won't even notice. Though I should warn you, protective magic this strong tends to make magical children a bit more energetic. Something about the ambient magical field. Amelia smiled slightly, thinking of Susan's already formidable capacity for destruction. I'll stock up on toys that can't be broken. As Bill began laying out his materials, Amelia returned to the house to find both children awake and fussing. Harry had pulled himself upright in his crib and was gripping the rails with white-knuckled determination, clearly frustrated by his inability to climb out. Susan, meanwhile, had somehow managed to remove her diaper and was in the process of trying to eat it. "No, sweetheart," Amelia murmured, extracting the soggy fabric from Susan's mouth and lifting her niece onto her hip. "That's not food." She collected Harry as well, settling both children on the sitting room carpet with a pile of soft toys. They immediately ignored the toys in favor of each other, Susan reaching out to pat Harry's dark hair with wet fingers while he grabbed at her sleeve with fascination. This was what mattered, Amelia thought. Not the wards or the legal documents or the complex magical theory. Just 2 children who had lost everything, slowly learning to trust that they were safe. Outside, she could hear Bill Weasley beginning his work, the low hum of protective magic settling into the bones of the house, like a promise. The first sign that Harry Potter was not going to be an ordinary child came on a Tuesday morning in March of 1982, when Amelia found him sitting contentedly in his crib, despite the fact that the safety latch was still firmly secured. Harry was barely 18 months old, still unsteady on his feet, and the crib rails were nearly 3 feet high. There was no conceivable way he could have climbed back in after escaping. "Susan," Amelia called, though she already knew her niece was downstairs in the kitchen, having just finished smearing porridge across every available surface. "Did you help Harry get back into his crib?" Susan's answering babble from below was unintelligible, but clearly innocent. At barely 2 years old, Susan could climb out of her own crib with determination and stubbornness, but she couldn't lift Harry back into his. Amelia studied the toddler, who beamed at her with those unsettlingly bright green eyes, and held up his arms to be picked up. His lightning bolt scar was barely visible beneath his unruly black hair, but she sometimes caught herself staring at it anyway, wondering what kind of magic was still trapped there. "Magic doesn't follow rules when you're involved, does it?" she murmured, lifting him out of the crib. Harry giggled and grabbed at her hair, apparently delighted by the conversation. By the time Harry turned 2, the incidents had become a daily occurrence. Toys that appeared in his hands, despite being on high shelves, water that stopped mid-fall when he knocked over his cup, the peculiar way the garden flowers always bloomed more brightly on the days when Harry played outside. Susan, meanwhile, showed more conventional signs of magical development. Small objects floating when she was particularly excited, lights flickering when she had tantrums, the occasional burst of sparks when she laughed too hard. Amelia learned to approach these manifestations with the same pragmatic acceptance she brought to her work at the ministry. Magic was part of their world. Children with magical abilities would naturally produce magical accidents. The fact that Harry's accidents seemed to bend the usual rules was simply another challenge to navigate. The challenge of balancing her position as head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement with raising 2 magical children proved more complicated than managing accidental magic. The DMLE was finally beginning to function normally after the chaos of the war, but normal still meant long days investigating the remnants of Death Eater activity, processing prisoners, and rebuilding the department's reputation for fairness and competence. Amelia had hired Mrs. Clearwater, a witch in her 60s whose own children were grown, to watch Harry and Susan during the day. Mrs. Clearwater had the patience of a saint and the reflexes necessary to manage 2 magically active toddlers. More importantly, she understood the need for discretion. Few people knew that Harry Potter was living quietly in a house in Kent, and Amelia intended to keep it that way. "They're good children," Mrs. Clearwater reported one evening as Amelia arrived home to find both toddlers napping peacefully on the sitting room carpet. Bright as buttons, both of them. But Harry... She paused, searching for words. "Sometimes I catch him staring at a nothing, as though he's listening to something the rest of us can't hear." Amelia had noticed the same thing. Harry would sometimes go very still, his head tilted slightly, his green eyes focused on some distant point. During these episodes, his scar would occasionally darken, becoming more prominent against his pale forehead. The moments never lasted long, usually just a few seconds, but they left Amelia with a persistent unease that she couldn't quite name. She consulted healer Josephine Gray at St. Mungo's, choosing someone she trusted to be both competent and discreet. Gray examined Harry during one of their regular visits to check on the Longbottoms, while the toddler played with a set of magical blocks that changed colors when stacked. "The scar tissue shows traces of very old magic," Gray told Amelia quietly, keeping her voice low enough that the children wouldn't overhear. "Dark magic, but contained. It's almost as though something tried to take root there and was rejected, I suppose. Pushed out, but not completely eliminated. Is it dangerous?" Amelia watched Harry stack his blocks with the focused concentration that 2-year-olds brought to important tasks. Susan sat beside him, occasionally knocking down his towers with gleeful determination. "Not immediately, but I'd recommend monitoring him for any changes in behavior, particularly around times of stress or strong emotion. Dark magic doesn't simply disappear. It finds ways to manifest." Their visits to St. Mungo's had become a monthly ritual, ostensibly for Harry's checkups, but also to see Frank and Alice Longbottom in the Janus Thickey ward. Amelia felt obligated to bear witness to what the war had cost, to ensure that their sacrifice wasn't forgotten in the general relief that Voldemort was gone. Frank and Alice never showed any recognition when Amelia brought the children to visit. They sat by the window in their hospital gowns, staring at nothing, occasionally smiling at some private thought or reaching for objects that weren't there. The healers said their condition was permanent. The damage done by prolonged exposure to the Cruciatus curse was irreversible. Neville visited with his grandmother on the same schedule, and the children had gradually become accustomed to each other's presence in the quiet, sterile room. At 3 years old, Neville was a round-faced, solemn little boy who spoke in whispers and stayed close to Augusta Longbottom's side. Harry and Susan, by contrast, seemed to treat the hospital visits as adventures, fascinated by the magical equipment and friendly with the healers who had known them since they were babies. Uncle Frank looked sad today, Susan announced during one visit in the spring of 1984, her 4-year-old vocabulary still struggling with concepts too large for anyone to fully understand. Harry, who had been playing with a toy dragon on the floor, looked up at Frank Longbottom's empty face. "He's sleeping," Harry said solemnly. "But not the kind where you wake up." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. Harry was barely 3.5 years old. He shouldn't have had the words for such a profound observation, let alone the insight to make it. That same spring, Harry's magical incidents began to take on a more protective quality. When Susan fell from the garden swing and scraped her knee, Harry's distress somehow caused every flower within 10 feet to bloom simultaneously, creating a carpet of petals to cushion her landing. When Mrs. Clearwater accidentally knocked over a pot of boiling water while making tea, Harry's cry of alarm seemed to freeze the water in mid-air, giving her time to step safely aside. "It's as though he can't bear to see people hurt," Mrs. Clearwater observed, watching Harry carefully bandage his toy dragon's wing with strips of cloth. "Even his toys, he gets upset when they're damaged." The protective instincts extended beyond preventing immediate harm. Harry seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense when Susan was having nightmares, appearing in her room before the first cry to sit by her bed until the bad dreams passed. He would find lost objects before anyone realized they were missing, guide visitors away from the stairs when Mrs. Clearwater had just mopped them, somehow know when Amelia had had particularly difficult days at work and needed extra hugs. Susan, for her part, had appointed herself Harry's fierce defender against any real or imagined slight. When a neighbor's child called Harry's scar ugly during a rare playdate, Susan's magical tantrum shattered 3 windows and turned the boy's hair temporarily blue. When Harry seemed sad after visiting the Longbottoms, Susan would insist on sharing her favorite toys, her pudding, even her treasured stuffed rabbit. They had developed their own language of gestures and half-words that made perfect sense to them and no sense to anyone else. They could communicate entire conversations with looks, coordinate elaborate games without speaking, and seemed to know instinctively when the other needed comfort or space. By 1985, when both children were approaching their 5th birthdays, Amelia had begun to understand that she hadn't simply taken in 2 orphaned children. She had somehow acquired a bonded pair, siblings in all but blood, protective of each other in ways that went beyond normal family affection. "They're good for each other," she told Arthur Weasley during one of his periodic visits to check on the house's protective wards. Harry and Susan were in the garden, engaged in the elaborate process of building a fairy house that would inevitably collapse before completion, but which occupied them happily for hours. "They are indeed," Arthur agreed, watching Susan carefully explain to Harry why the roof needed to be oriented toward the east for proper fairy feng shui. "Harry seems calmer than I might have expected, given everything he's been through," Having Susan there, having a normal childhood with someone who doesn't see him as the boy who lived, it's probably the best thing that could have happened to him. Amelia nodded, though she sometimes worried about what would happen when the children grew older and Harry's fame became impossible to ignore. For now, though, he was simply Harry, the boy who sang himself to sleep, who insisted on checking that all the doors were locked before bedtime, who saved the broken biscuits for himself so that Susan could have the perfect ones. That evening, as she tucked both children into their beds in the room they still preferred to share, despite having separate bedrooms available, Harry looked up at her with those serious green eyes. "Aunt Amelia," he said softly, "why don't I remember my first mum and dad?" It was the first time he had asked directly, though she had seen the question in his face for months. Susan, already half asleep in the next bed, opened her eyes to listen. "You were very little when they died," Amelia said gently, sitting on the edge of Harry's bed. "Barely more than a baby. Most people don't remember much from when they were that young. But I remember when I came here. I remember Susan crying the first night. Some memories stick better than others, usually the ones that matter most." Harry considered this with the gravity of someone much older than 4 years old. "I think they would have liked you," he said finally. "My first parents. I think they would have wanted me to be here." Amelia's throat tightened. "I think so too, sweetheart." As she turned off the lights and closed the door, she could hear them whispering to each other in the darkness, the same comfortable murmur that had become the soundtrack of her evenings. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever complications Harry's identity might bring to their quiet life, she knew with certainty that she had made the right choice that November night 4 years ago. Some families were born, others were carefully, lovingly built. Harry was 6 years old when he first asked why people stared at him in Diagon Alley. He and Susan had accompanied Amelia on what should have been a routine trip to purchase new scales for potions ingredients the DMLE confiscated from illegal brewing operations. The children had been promised ice cream from Fortescue's afterward, a treat that made even the most boring ministry errands tolerable. But halfway through Knockturn Alley, where the less reputable apothecaries sold ingredients that couldn't be found in more legitimate establishments, Harry had tugged on Amelia's robes and pointed to a cluster of witches who were whispering behind their hands while looking in their direction. "Why do they keep looking at my forehead?" Harry asked, unconsciously brushing his fringe down over his scar. "Did I get something on it?" Susan, who had inherited her aunt's observational skills along with her stubborn streak, crossed her arms and glared at the whispering witches. "It's rude to stare," she announced loudly enough for them to hear. "My aunt says so." The witches scattered, but not before Amelia caught the words, "boy who lived," and "can't be sure," floating back on the spring breeze. That evening, after Susan had fallen asleep clutching her new picture book about famous witches, Amelia sat on the edge of Harry's bed and tried to find words for a conversation she had been dreading for years. "Do you remember what I told you about your parents?" she began carefully. Harry nodded solemnly. "They died when I was a baby. There was a bad wizard who wanted to hurt people, and they died protecting me." "That's right. What I haven't told you is that the bad wizard, his name was Voldemort, he was very powerful and very dangerous. Many people tried to stop him, but they couldn't. Until the night he came to your house." Harry's hand drifted unconsciously to his forehead. "What happened to him?" "We don't know exactly, but when he tried to hurt you, something went wrong with his magic. The spell bounced back at him instead of hurting you. It left you with that scar, and it made Voldemort disappear. Forever? Amelia hesitated. She had asked herself the same question countless times, especially during Harry's strange episodes when his scar would darken and he would stare at nothing with those two knowing eyes. "We hope so. But you were the first person to survive when he used that particular spell. That's why some people call you the boy who lived." Harry considered this with the serious expression he wore when processing information too large for his years. "Is that why people stare?" "Yes, but Harry..." She waited until he met her eyes. "What matters isn't what happened when you were a baby, or what people call you, or why they stare. What matters is who you choose to be now. Do you understand?" "I think so." He was quiet for a moment. "Am I different from other children? Really different? I mean, not just the magic things." The question pierced her heart with its careful precision. At 6 years old, Harry was already learning to analyze the weight of other people's attention, already beginning to understand that his very existence meant something to the magical world that had nothing to do with who he actually was. "You're exactly as different as you choose to be," she said firmly, "and you're exactly as much the same as you choose to be." Through the spring and summer of 1987, Amelia began introducing the children to carefully selected aspects of her work at the ministry. She brought them to her office on Saturday mornings when the department was quiet, letting them explore the magical filing systems and meet the auras who had become something like extended family. Kingsley Shacklebolt was Harry's particular favorite, perhaps because he was one of the few adults who never stared at Harry's scar or lowered his voice to a reverent whisper when speaking to him. Instead, Kingsley taught Harry and Susan how to organize case files by date, explained the difference between hexes and curses in terms simple enough for 7-year-olds to understand, and answered their endless questions about what dark wizards actually did with stolen sneakerscopes. "Uncle Kingsley," Susan said one Saturday afternoon while sorting through a box of confiscated dark arts detection equipment, "why do bad wizards always want to hurt people?" Kingsley paused in his demonstration of a particularly sensitive dark arts detector to consider the question seriously. "Same reason bad muggles want to hurt people, I suppose. They think it will get them something they want. Power, or money, or revenge. They think it will make them feel better about themselves." "Does it?" Harry asked quietly. "Never for very long. That's why they keep doing worse and worse things, trying to fill up the empty place inside them. But you can't fix emptiness by creating more of it in other people." Harry nodded, as though this made perfect sense, but Amelia noticed him touching his scar absently as he processed the concept of emptiness trying to fill itself. It was during one of these ministry visits that Harry met Luna Lovegood, though neither child understood the significance of the encounter at the time. Luna's father, Xenophilius, had business with the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, something about a dirigible plum tree that had achieved independent flight and was terrorizing the neighbors, and had brought his 6-year-old daughter along, rather than leave her with a babysitter. Luna was a pale, dreamy child with silvery hair and enormous eyes, who seemed to exist slightly apart from the rest of the world. She took one look at Harry and announced, "You have nargles in your scar, but they're sleeping now, so that's all right." Harry blinked. "What are nargles?" "Tiny creatures that nest in mistletoe and cause mischief. Daddy says they're attracted to places where dark magic has been." Luna tilted her head, studying Harry with scientific interest. "Yours are different, though. Sadder." Susan, ever protective, stepped between Harry and Luna with her hands on her hips. "You're not supposed to say things about Harry's scar. It's rude." "Oh, I wasn't being rude," Luna said serenely. "I was being observant. There's a difference." She turned to Susan with the same dreamy intensity. You have a lovely protective aura, very golden, like warm honey. Despite Susan's initial suspicion, the three children spent the afternoon constructing an elaborate theory about which magical creatures might be responsible for various ministry problems. Luna's imagination was boundless and completely unconstrained by conventional logic. Harry found her willingness to consider impossible things refreshing, while Susan appreciated having another girl who wasn't impressed by Harry's fame. "She's odd," Susan announced on the way home. "But I like her. She doesn't care that Harry's famous." "She might be the only person in the magical world who doesn't," Amelia replied, though she made a mental note to keep in touch with Xenophilius Lovegood. Luna's casual acceptance of Harry as simply another child might prove valuable as he grew older. The friendship with Luna led to other connections with magical families. The Weasleys became regular visitors after Arthur's continued work on the house's protective wards created opportunities for their children to meet Harry and Susan. Ron Weasley, a year younger than Harry, was initially intimidated by meeting the boy who lived, but quickly forgot his awe when Harry proved to be completely hopeless at exploding snap and needed Ron's help to understand the rules. "He's just normal," Ron reported to his parents with obvious relief after his first playdate at the Bones house. "I mean, he does magic things by accident sometimes, but so does everyone. And Susan's brilliant at Quidditch. She caught a snitch I threw even though she's never seen one before." These friendships provided Harry and Susan with a broader understanding of magical families and customs. They learned about Quidditch from the Weasleys, about magical creature care from Luna's father, about herbology from Neville's grandmother, when Augusta Longbottom occasionally brought Neville for visits that combined seeing his parents at St. Mungo's with social calls. Neville, now 7 years old, remained quiet and serious, but he bloomed around plants in a way that reminded Amelia powerfully of his mother. When Harry asked why Neville always seemed sad, Amelia found herself explaining, in terms appropriate for 7-year-olds, what the war had cost and why it was important to be kind to people who had lost family. "But you lost family too," Harry said thoughtfully. "And Susan lost her parents. Are we sad all the time?" "Sometimes we are," Amelia replied honestly. "But we have each other now. Neville doesn't have parents or siblings, just his grandmother, and she's doing her best. But it's hard to be the only family someone has left." This conversation led to Harry and Susan making extra efforts to include Neville in their games, to listen when he talked about plants, to share their books and toys during his visits. Susan, in particular, seemed to understand instinctively that Neville needed patient encouragement rather than the boisterous enthusiasm that worked with Ron or Luna. By 1988, when Harry was 8 and Susan was 7 going on 30, they had developed a small but solid group of magical friends and a basic understanding of their place in the wizarding world. Harry knew that he was famous for something he couldn't remember, that his parents had died heroically, and that some people expected things from him that he didn't yet understand. But he also knew that Aunt Amelia would answer his questions honestly, that Susan would defend him against anyone who tried to make him feel different in ways he didn't want to be different, and that his friends cared more about whether he shared his sweets than whether he had defeated a Dark Lord as a baby. The morning Harry turned 8, he woke to find Susan sitting on his bed with a badly wrapped package and a serious expression. "I made you something," she announced, thrusting the gift at him. Aunt Amelia helped with the magic parts, but the rest was me. Inside the lumpy wrapping was a photo album, clearly handmade, with Harry's real life written across the cover in Susan's careful script. The pages were filled with photographs from their life together. Harry and Susan building sand castles on the beach, playing in the garden, reading stories, celebrating birthdays and holidays. There were pictures of Amelia teaching them to cook, of ministry friends visiting for dinner, of quiet moments that had probably seemed unremarkable when they happened, but which, collected together, told the story of a childhood built on love rather than legend. On the last page, Susan had pasted a photograph of just the two of them asleep in the garden last summer, surrounded by the fairy houses they had built and abandoned. Beneath it, in her improving handwriting, she had written, "This is who you really are." Harry stared at the album for a long moment, then looked up at Susan with eyes that were bright with tears he was trying not to shed. "Thank you," he said, quietly. And Amelia, watching from the doorway, knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, Harry would face them with a clear understanding of what truly mattered. Some kinds of fame were thrust upon you, but some kinds of love you chose for yourself and built carefully, one ordinary day at a time. Albus Dumbledore arrived on a Tuesday evening in October, when the autumn rain was hammering against the windows of the Bones house, and both children were absorbed in a complicated board game that involved moving pieces, exploding squares, and rules that seemed to change whenever Susan was losing. Amelia had been expecting his visit for weeks, ever since she had sent word through Kingsley that she needed to speak with him about Harry's future. She had not expected him to look quite so old. The man who stepped out of her flu connection was still tall and commanding, his beard still magnificent, his robes still flowing with the kind of dramatic flair that had made him a legend at Hogwarts. But there were new lines around his eyes, and when he removed his half-moon spectacles to clean them, his hands shook slightly. "Amelia," he said warmly, inclining his head. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but your message suggested the matter was urgent. Professor Dumbledore." She gestured toward the sitting room, where a tea service was already waiting. "The children are in the kitchen. We can speak privately here." They settled into chairs by the fire, and for a moment Amelia found herself studying the man who had placed Harry with the Dursleys 8 years ago. She had respected Albus Dumbledore for decades, had trusted his leadership during the war, had never questioned his decisions about strategy or tactics, but she had also never been personally affected by those decisions until the night she brought Harry home. "You look well," Dumbledore said gently, apparently reading something in her expression. "Parenthood suits you." "I'm not his parent. I'm his guardian." The correction came out sharper than she had intended. "His parents died protecting him. I'm simply doing my best to honor their sacrifice." "Of course." Dumbledore sipped his tea thoughtfully. "And how is Harry adjusting? I understand he's been with you for nearly 8 years now." "He's thriving. Both children are. They're healthy, happy, magically developing normally, and they have strong friendships within the magical community." Amelia kept her voice level, professional. "But that's not why I asked you here." Dumbledore set down his teacup and folded his hands in his lap. "No. I suspected it wasn't. What troubles you, Amelia?" "Harry's magic has been growing stronger, more focused. Last month, when Susan fell from her broomstick, just a small training broom, nothing dangerous, Harry's magic stopped her fall from 20 feet away. Not slowed it, stopped it completely. She hung in mid-air for nearly 10 seconds before he could calm down enough for his magic to release her. Accidental magic often increases in power as children approach Hogwarts age. This wasn't accidental." Amelia leaned forward. "Harry saw Susan falling, decided she shouldn't be hurt, and his magic responded to that decision. Deliberately, consciously. That's not how magic works for 9-year-olds, Professor." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. When he spoke again, His voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "There are things about Harry's history that you don't know. Things I had hoped might not matter, given the circumstances of his upbringing." He removed his spectacles again, cleaning them with movements that seemed more nervous than necessary. "Have you ever heard of a prophecy concerning the Dark Lord's downfall?" Amelia felt something cold settle in her stomach. "No. It was made the night Harry was born. A prediction about a child who would have the power to vanquish Voldemort, a child born as the 7th month dies, to parents who had thrice defied him." Dumbledore's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The prophecy was overheard by a Death Eater, reported to Voldemort, and became the reason he targeted the Potter family. "You're telling me that Harry was marked for death because of a prophecy?" The words came out flat, controlled, but Amelia could hear the fury building underneath them. "Yes, though you should know that Harry was not the only child who could have fulfilled the prophecy's requirements. Neville Longbottom was born one day before Harry, and his parents had also defied Voldemort 3 times. The choice of which child to pursue was Voldemort's alone." Amelia thought of Neville, quiet and serious, and still visiting his broken parents at St. Mungo's every month. But he chose Harry. He did. And in doing so, he marked Harry as his equal. Those were the prophecy's words. "The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal." Dumbledore put his spectacles back on, and his eyes looked infinitely tired. "The prophecy states that neither can live while the other survives." The sitting room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of Harry and Susan arguing about game rules in the kitchen. Amelia stared at Dumbledore, processing the enormity of what he had just told her. "You're saying that Harry and Voldemort are connected? That as long as one lives, the other can't truly die?" "The prophecy suggests as much. Voldemort's failed attempt to kill Harry 8 years ago appears to have created some form of magical bond between them. Harry's unusual magical development, his protective instincts, the episodes with his scar, all of this may be connected to that bond." Amelia stood abruptly, unable to remain seated, while learning that the child she had raised for 8 years was magically tied to the darkest wizard in British history. She walked to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked garden where Harry and Susan had built fairy houses just that morning. "Does Harry know?" "Not yet. I had hoped." Dumbledore paused. "I had hoped that growing up in a loving home, away from the pressure of fame and expectation, might change the trajectory somehow. That love might be enough to break whatever connection exists between them. But you don't think it has?" "I think love has given Harry something Voldemort never had, the ability to choose compassion over cruelty, protection over power. But I don't think it has broken the fundamental connection the prophecy describes." Dumbledore stood as well, moving to join her at the window. "The question now is how to prepare him for what may come." "What may come?" Amelia turned to face him. "Professor, are you telling me that Voldemort is still alive? That he could return?" "I am telling you that his defeat 8 years ago was not as final as the magical world believes. Dark magic of the kind Voldemort practiced leaves traces, creates possibilities for survival that most wizards would consider impossible." Dumbledore's reflection in the window looked older than his 100+ years. "Harry's scar is one such trace. The connection it represents suggests that Voldemort's spirit survived, diminished, but not destroyed." The sound of laughter from the kitchen Harry's delighted giggle, as Susan apparently discovered a new way to cheat at their game, felt surreal against the backdrop of their conversation. "What do you need from me?" Amelia asked quietly. "Continue as you have been. Love him. Protect him. Give him the foundation of family and friendship that will sustain him through whatever comes. But also be prepared to enhance his protection as he grows older. His power is increasing, and that may draw attention from those who served Voldemort and hope for his return. We already have the strongest wards Bill Weasley could design. I was thinking of something more comprehensive, training, perhaps, not just in magic, but in defense, in understanding the nature of the threats he may face." Dumbledore turned from the window to meet her eyes. "I'm not suggesting we steal his childhood, Amelia, but we cannot pretend that childhood will last forever." That night, after Dumbledore had left and the children were asleep, Amelia sat in her study, reviewing security protocols and trying to process everything she had learned. The prophecy explained so much: Harry's unusual magical development, the protective nature of his accidental magic, the strange episodes where he seemed to sense things beyond his years. It also changed everything. She found herself thinking about Neville, about the random cruelty that had made Harry the target instead of him. If Voldemort had chosen the Longbottoms instead of the Potters, would Harry be visiting broken parents in St. Mungo's, while Neville carried the weight of prophecy and fame? The question led her to make a decision that felt both obvious and terrifying. The next morning, she sent owls to Augusta Longbottom and to Kingsley Shacklebolt. If Harry's destiny was tied to Voldemort's potential return, then he would need allies who understood the stakes, and if Neville's parallel situation meant he might also be at risk, then both boys deserved protection that went beyond standard security measures. Some prophecies, she was beginning to understand, required more than love to fulfill safely. They required preparation, vigilance, and the kind of careful planning that came from accepting that childhood innocence was a luxury that might not last as long as she had hoped. But as she listened to Harry and Susan planning their day over breakfast, an elaborate scheme involving a picnic for their toys and a treasure hunt through the garden, she promised herself that whatever preparations were necessary, they would not come at the cost of the life she had built for them. Harry might be marked by prophecy, but he was also marked by love, friendship, and the everyday magic of a childhood filled with laughter and security. The prophecy might define his destiny, but it would not define his daily experience of being loved. The letter from Flourish and Blots arrived on a crisp February morning in 1990, just as Harry was finishing his porridge and Susan was attempting to teach their owl, Archimedes, to deliver imaginary messages to her dolls. The letter's contents were innocent enough, an advertisement for their new educational series designed to prepare magical children for formal schooling, but it sent a jolt of reality through Amelia that she hadn't expected. Harry would be 11 in July. In just over a year, he would receive his Hogwarts letter. "What's that, Aunt Amelia?" Harry asked, noticing her expression as she read the pamphlet describing pre-Hogwarts tutorial programs and educational materials. "Information about schools," she replied carefully, watching his face for signs of excitement or anxiety. "You and Susan will be starting your magical education soon. I thought we should begin preparing." Susan dropped her spoon with a clatter that made Archimedes squawk indignantly. "Real school? With other children and teachers and everything?" "Real school," Amelia confirmed, "though not quite yet. This year, we'll start with some basic preparation, learning more about magical theory, practicing with simple spells under supervision, meeting other children who will be starting school when you do." Harry's green eyes lit up with curiosity, but she caught the flicker of uncertainty beneath the excitement. At 10 years old, Harry had spent nearly his entire life within the protective boundaries of their home and carefully selected social circle. The prospect of a larger, less controllable environment would naturally be daunting. That afternoon, she took both children to Diagon Alley for what she announced as an educational expedition. Their first stop was Flourish and Blots, where the proprietor, Mr. Blot, greeted them with the enthusiasm of a man who saw potential customers in two bright, curious children. "Ah, young Master Potter and Miss Bones," he said warmly. "Here for the pre-Hogwarts preparation materials, I'd wager. We have an excellent selection, designed specifically for children your age." He led them to a section of the shop Amelia had never noticed before, filled with books written specifically for 10- and 11-year-olds. Basic magical theory for young minds, a child's guide to magical creatures, simple spells and when to use them, and dozens of others with colourful covers and engaging illustrations. Harry gravitated immediately toward a book about magical defences, while Susan became absorbed in a tome about magical plants that included seeds for readers to grow their own specimens. Watching them browse with such focused intensity, Amelia felt a familiar mixture of pride and protective anxiety. "They're bright children," Mr. Blot observed quietly. Young Harry in particular has an unusual focus for his age. That book on defensive magic he's reading isn't typically popular with 10-year-olds. "He's always been interested in protection," Amelia replied, which was true if incomplete. She didn't mention that Harry's interest in defensive magic had intensified noticeably since the previous autumn, when his magical incidents had begun showing more deliberate protective qualities. Their next stop was Ollivander's, though Amelia made it clear that they were only visiting to learn about wands, not to purchase them. Mr. Ollivander emerged from the dusty depths of his shop with the same unsettling intensity he had always possessed, his pale eyes fixing immediately on Harry. "Harry Potter," he said softly, "I was wondering when you might come to visit, though I suspect it will be some time yet before you're ready for a wand of your own." "How do wands choose wizards?" Harry asked directly, apparently unperturbed by Ollivander's stare. "Everyone says they choose you, but how do they decide?" Ollivander's expression became thoughtful. "A wand responds to the magical signature of the wizard, the unique combination of power, intent, and character that makes each magical person distinct. Some wands prefer bold magic, others subtle. Some respond to protective instincts, others to ambition or curiosity." His gaze never left Harry's face. "Your wand, when the time comes, will be drawn to the qualities that define your magic. I suspect it will be interesting to see what chooses you." Susan, meanwhile, had become fascinated by the process of wand-making itself, asking detailed questions about wood types, core materials, and the difference between phoenix feather and dragon heartstring cores. Ollivander answered her queries with patience, clearly appreciating her methodical approach to understanding magical theory. As they left the shop, Harry was unusually quiet. Finally, as they stopped for ice cream at Fortescue's, he looked up at Amelia with a serious expression. "Mr. Ollivander knows something about my wand already, doesn't he?" Harry asked. "Something he's not saying." Amelia paused with her spoon halfway to her mouth. Harry's perceptiveness continued to surprise her, even after 10 years. "Why do you think that?" "The way he looked at me, like he was remembering something instead of just meeting me." Harry stirred his ice cream thoughtfully. "It's the same way people look at my scar sometimes, like they know things about me that I don't know about myself." "Would it bother you if that were true?" Harry considered this with the gravity he brought to all important questions. "I think I'd rather know the things they know, even if they're bad things." Not knowing makes me feel like I'm missing parts of myself. That evening, Amelia wrote letters to several magical families she knew, arranging informal gatherings where Harry and Susan could meet other children their age who would be starting Hogwarts in the coming years. The Weasleys were obvious choices. Ron would be in Harry's year, and Ginny only a year behind Susan. The Longbottoms were equally important, given Neville's connection to the prophecy that now overshadowed so much of Harry's future. The first of these gatherings took place on a sunny Saturday in March at the Burrow. Arthur and Molly Weasley had enthusiastically agreed to host what Molly called a proper children's party, complete with games, treats, and the controlled chaos that came naturally to a household full of magical children. Harry and Susan arrived to find the Weasley garden transformed into an elaborate playground of magical games and activities. Ron was there, along with his younger sister Ginny, who hung back shyly near her mother, despite being only a few months younger than Susan. Neville had come with his grandmother, and Luna Lovegood had been brought by her father, who seemed delighted to have an excuse to discuss his latest theories about magical creatures with any adult who would listen. "Harry!" Ron called excitedly as they arrived. "Come look at this. Fred and George taught me how to make a quaffle that changes direction in mid-flight. Want to try catching it?" Harry grinned and ran off to join the game, leaving Susan to gravitate toward Luna, who was sitting cross-legged under a tree, carefully weaving flowers into a chain while humming to herself. "What are you making?" Susan asked, settling beside her. "A charm for detecting Nargles," Luna replied serenely. "They're particularly active in gardens with so much laughter, but these flowers should keep them from becoming mischievous." Augusta Longbottom approached Amelia as they watched the children play. "How is Harry adjusting to the idea of Hogwarts?" she asked quietly. "He's excited, but apprehensive, as any intelligent child should be." Amelia glanced toward where Neville was carefully tending to a magical plant that Molly had brought out for the children to examine. "How is Neville feeling about it?" "Worried that he won't live up to his parents' reputation," Augusta admitted. "Frank and Alice were both brilliant students, and Neville knows that. He puts tremendous pressure on himself to honor their memory." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their boys, for that was how Amelia had come to think of both Harry and Neville, connected as they were by prophecy and circumstance, learning to navigate the social dynamics that would shape their Hogwarts years. The party was interrupted by the arrival of an official ministry owl, bearing news that sent ripples of excitement through the adult gathering. Cornelius Fudge had been confirmed as the new Minister for Magic, replacing Millicent Bagnold after her retirement. "Fudge?" Arthur frowned as he read the announcement. "I wouldn't have expected him to get the appointment. He's competent enough, but hardly inspiring leadership material." "He's politically safe," Amelia replied, though privately she had her own concerns about Fudge's tendency to prioritize public opinion over difficult decisions. After the upheaval of the war years, the Wizengamot probably wanted someone who wouldn't rock the boat. As the afternoon wound down and families began gathering their children for departure, Harry approached Amelia with an expression of thoughtful satisfaction. "I like them," he announced simply. "Ron's funny, and Neville knows more about plants than anyone I've ever met. And Luna sees things differently than other people, but that makes her interesting, not strange." "I'm glad," Amelia replied, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying begin to lift. "Friendships like these will matter more than you know when you get to Hogwarts." That night, as she tucked both children into their beds, though at 9 and 10 they were rapidly approaching the age where this ritual would end, Amelia found herself thinking about the prophecy and its implications for Harry's schooling. Hogwarts was safe, certainly. Dumbledore was there, along with teachers who were skilled in both magic and protection. But it was also public, exposed, filled with children who would know Harry's fame, even if they didn't understand its true significance. More concerning was the possibility that Voldemort's supporters, those who had escaped justice after the war, might see Harry's entry into the wider magical world as an opportunity. The protections around their home were strong, but Hogwarts would require different safeguards, different vigilance. She made a mental note to speak with Dumbledore about security arrangements to ensure that Harry's transition to formal education didn't come at the cost of his safety. The prophecy might be inescapable, but that didn't mean she had to make it easy for its darker implications to manifest. Some destinies, she was learning, required careful management rather than passive acceptance. And if Harry was destined to face Voldemort again someday, then she would ensure he faced that destiny with every possible advantage: strong friendships, excellent training, and the unshakable foundation of a childhood filled with love and normal experiences. The prophecy might define his ultimate fate, but his preparation for that fate would be her responsibility, and she intended to execute it flawlessly. The owl arrived precisely at dawn on July 31st, as though it had been waiting for the exact moment Harry Potter turned 11 years old. Amelia found it perched on the kitchen windowsill when she came downstairs to start breakfast, 2 thick parchment envelopes tied to its leg with emerald ribbon. She knew what they were before she untied them. The Hogwarts crest was unmistakable, embossed in deep green wax on cream-colored parchment that seemed to glow with its own inner light. One envelope was addressed to Mr. H. Potter in precise script that somehow managed to convey both formality and warmth. The other bore the name Miss S. Bones in the same elegant handwriting. Amelia stood in her kitchen, holding the letters that would change everything, listening to the sounds of both children stirring upstairs. In a few hours they would officially be Hogwarts students. In 6 weeks they would leave for school, and her daily responsibility for their safety and well-being would shift to others. She had known this day was coming for months, had prepared for it, planned for it, even looked forward to it in many ways. But holding the actual letters in her hands brought a surge of protective anxiety that surprised her with its intensity. "Aunt Amelia?" Harry's voice carried down from the top of the stairs, followed immediately by the sound of his bare feet on the wooden steps. "Did I hear an owl?" "Happy birthday," she said, holding up the letters as he reached the kitchen doorway. "I believe these are for you and Susan." Harry's eyes widened as he took in the official seals and elegant addresses. Susan appeared behind him, still wearing her nightgown, and rubbing sleep from her eyes. But she became instantly alert when she saw the parchment in Amelia's hands. "Are those—" Susan began. "Hogwarts letters," Harry finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're really here." Amelia handed each child their letter and watched as they broke the wax seals with careful reverence. She had read their letters many times over the years. As head of the DMLE, she received copies of all Hogwarts correspondence for monitoring purposes. But watching Harry and Susan read their acceptance letters for the first time brought back memories of her own 11th birthday, decades ago. "Dear Mr. Potter," Harry read aloud, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." He looked up at Amelia with such pure joy that she felt her throat tighten. "I'm really going. It's real." Susan was already scanning her supply list with characteristic efficiency. Cauldron, pewter, standard size 2, 3 sets of plain work robes, 1 wand. She paused, looking up with sudden excitement. "We get to choose our wands today." "Today?" Harry asked, still clutching his letter. "Today," Amelia confirmed. "I thought we'd make a proper celebration of it. Diagon Alley for supplies, lunch at the Leaky Cauldron, and ice cream at Fortescue's. A birthday and Hogwarts shopping expedition combined. 2 hours later, they stepped through the entrance to Diagon Alley to find the shopping district busier than Amelia had seen it in years. The post-war rebuilding was complete, and the magical community had clearly regained its confidence. Families with children clutching Hogwarts letters moved between shops with the purposeful energy of back-to-school preparation. Their first stop was Madame Malkin's for robes, where both Harry and Susan were measured for their Hogwarts uniforms. Susan chatted easily with Madame Malkin about fabric weights and proper hem lengths, while Harry stood quietly on his fitting platform, watching other soon-to-be students being fitted nearby. "Excited about Hogwarts?" asked a pale boy with sharp features who was being measured on the adjacent platform. "I can hardly wait. Father says Hogwarts has declined since Dumbledore took over, but it's still the best magical education available in Britain." "What's wrong with Dumbledore?" Harry asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. The boy smirked. "He's too lenient with the wrong sort of people. Mudbloods and blood traitors get the same treatment as proper purebloods. Father says it leads to a decline in standards." Harry's expression cooled noticeably. "I wouldn't know about that. I just know Professor Dumbledore has kept the wizarding world safe." "Safe for whom?" the boy countered. "My father says." "Perhaps," Amelia interjected smoothly, stepping closer to Harry's platform, "we should focus on getting properly fitted for robes. First impressions at Hogwarts matter tremendously." The boy glanced at her with newfound wariness, apparently recognizing authority when he heard it. The fitting continued in relative silence, though Amelia caught the boy staring at Harry's forehead with obvious interest. Their next stop was Flourish and Blots, where they collected the required textbooks, and Susan insisted on purchasing several supplemental volumes that weren't on the official list, but looked potentially useful. Harry was drawn to the Defense Against the Dark Arts section, though he settled for the required first-year text after Amelia suggested that additional reading could wait until after he'd mastered the basics. The real excitement came at Ollivander's, where Mr. Ollivander emerged from the depths of his shop with the same unsettling intensity Amelia remembered from their previous visit. "Ah," he said softly, his pale eyes fixing on Harry. "Mr. Potter, I've been expecting you." His gaze shifted to Susan. "And Miss Bones, 2 young wizards ready for their first wands. How exciting." He began with Susan, bringing out box after box of wands for her to try. The third wand produced golden sparks when she held it, and Ollivander clapped his hands with satisfaction. Vine wood with a dragon heartstring core, 10 3/4 inches, quite flexible. Excellent for charm work and particularly suited to witches with strong protective instincts. He wrapped the wand carefully and handed it to Susan, who was beaming with delight. Harry's fitting proved more complicated. Wand after wand failed to respond to his touch, some producing nothing at all, others generating effects that ranged from mildly disappointing to mildly alarming. After nearly an hour, Ollivander disappeared into the back of his shop, muttering to himself about unusual cases and difficult customers. He returned with a box that looked older than the others, its label faded with age. "Holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches. Nice and supple," he said, handing the wand to Harry with particular care. "I remember every wand I've ever sold, Mr. Potter. It so happens that the phoenix whose tail feather is in your wand gave another feather. Just one other. It is very curious indeed that you should be destined for this wand when its brother gave you that scar." Harry's hand tightened on the wand, and Amelia felt the temperature in the shop drop several degrees. "The same phoenix gave a feather for Voldemort's wand?" "The very same. Phoenix feathers are the rarest core type. The phoenix that provided these feathers gave only 2. It is curious that you should be destined for this particular wand, when its brother did such terrible things. Yes, 13.5 inches. You, powerful wand. Very powerful, and in the wrong hands. Well, if I'd known what that wand was going out into the world to do. Ollivander's voice trailed off as he studied Harry with renewed intensity. But this wand chose you, Mr. Potter. I think we must expect great things from you. After all, he who must not be named did great things. Terrible, yes, but great. Harry paid for the wand with money from his vault, but Amelia could see his discomfort with Ollivander's implications. As they left the shop, she made a mental note to have a conversation with him about the difference between power and the choice of how to use it. Their final stop was the apothecary for potion ingredients, where the real challenges began. The shop was crowded with Hogwarts families, and it took several minutes for anyone to recognize Harry. When they did, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. "Is that... It can't be... the scar... Harry Potter!" Within moments, a crowd had gathered around Harry, everyone trying to shake his hand, get a closer look at his famous scar, or simply say they had met the boy who lived. Parents thrust their children forward for introductions. Witches and wizards asked for autographs, and several people attempted to take photographs. Harry stood frozen in the center of the attention, his face pale, except for spots of color on his cheeks. Susan moved immediately to his side, taking his arm in a protective gesture that reminded Amelia powerfully of herself at that age. "Excuse me," Amelia said loudly, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "These are children trying to complete their school shopping. Please allow them some space." The crowd reluctantly began to disperse, though many continued to stare and whisper. Harry remained silent until they reached the Leaky Cauldron for lunch, where Tom the innkeeper showed them to a private booth away from curious eyes. "Is it always going to be like that?" Harry asked quietly, stirring his soup without eating it. "People staring and wanting things from me just because of something I don't even remember?" "Not always," Amelia replied honestly, "but probably often, especially in public, magical spaces. Fame is a burden as much as a gift, Harry. The question is what you choose to do with the attention when you receive it." Susan leaned forward. "I'll be there. At Hogwarts, I mean. If people bother you, I can tell them to stop." Harry managed a small smile. "Thanks, though I suspect I'll need to learn to handle it myself eventually." That evening, as they sat in the garden reviewing their purchases and talking about the approaching school year, Amelia watched both children with a mixture of pride and trepidation. They were ready for Hogwarts in all the ways that mattered: intelligent, well-educated, socially prepared, and equipped with the kind of strong friendship that would sustain them through challenges. But Harry's experience in Diagon Alley had reminded her that his fame was a complication they couldn't avoid forever. At Hogwarts, he would be among peers who knew his story, teachers who had expectations about his abilities, and potentially some who harbored resentments about the war's outcome. She could protect him from many things, but she couldn't protect him from being Harry Potter. The best she could do was ensure he faced that reality with confidence, preparation, and the knowledge that he was loved for who he was, not for what he represented to the magical world. Some challenges, she reflected, were meant to be faced rather than avoided, and if Harry was going to face the complexities of his identity, he would do so with every advantage she could provide. The morning of September 1st dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of light that made everything seem sharp-edged and significant. Amelia had been awake since 4, unable to sleep through what she knew would be one of the most important days of Harry and Susan's lives, and if she was honest with herself, one of the most difficult days of her own. She found both children already dressed and eating breakfast when she came downstairs, their trunks packed and waiting by the door. Susan was methodically working through a checklist she had written the night before, muttering about cauldrons and quills and whether she had packed enough socks. Harry sat quietly with his hands wrapped around a cup of tea, watching the steam rise as though it held answers to questions he hadn't yet learned to ask. "Nervous?" Amelia asked, settling into a chair with her own breakfast. "Excited," Susan replied immediately, "and maybe a little nervous, but mostly excited." Harry nodded agreement, though Amelia could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept touching the lightning-shaped scar on his forehead, as though reassuring himself it was still there. "Will you write to us?" he asked quietly. "Every week," she promised, "and you'll write to me, about your classes, your friends, what you're learning, how you're settling in. Everything." "What if we're not good at it?" Harry's voice was barely above a whisper. "What if we can't do magic properly when it matters?" Amelia reached across the table to cover his hand with hers. "You will be exactly as good at magic as you're meant to be, both of you. And if you struggle with something, you'll work harder until you understand it. That's what school is for, learning, not already knowing everything." The journey to King's Cross Station passed in a blur of last-minute preparations and careful conversation designed to avoid the growing reality of separation. Amelia had arranged for a ministry car rather than risk the complications of public transportation, and they arrived at the station with enough time to locate Platform 9 and 3/4 without rushing. "Remember," Amelia said as they approached the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, "walk straight at the wall between the platforms. Don't be nervous about hitting it. The magic will recognize you and let you through." Harry and Susan exchanged glances, then approached the barrier together, Susan's hand finding Harry's as they walked. The wall seemed solid until the moment they reached it, when it rippled like water and let them pass through into a world that was entirely magical. Platform 9 and 3/4 bustled with families, saying goodbye to children of all ages. The magnificent scarlet Hogwarts Express waited beside the platform, steam billowing from its chimney as uniformed students loaded trunks and said tearful farewells to parents, the air filled with a mixture of excitement, anxiety, and the particular chaos that came with hundreds of young people preparing for a journey. "Harry! Susan!" Ron Weasley's voice carried across the platform, and they turned to see him waving from near one of the train cars, his family clustered around him in a riot of red hair and warm hugs. They made their way through the crowd to where the Weasleys were gathered, and Amelia found herself immediately enveloped in the kind of maternal fussing that Molly Weasley extended to all children within her considerable sphere of influence. "Oh, don't they look grown up?" Molly exclaimed, smoothing down Harry's perpetually untidy hair and adjusting Susan's robes with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had sent many children off to Hogwarts. "First year for both of you. How exciting. Ron, you take care of them on the train. Make sure they find a good compartment." "Mum," Ron protested, his ears turning pink, but he was grinning as he said it. Arthur Weasley shook hands solemnly with both children, offering final words of encouragement about Hogwarts and reminding them that the journey itself was part of the adventure. The twins, Fred and George, appeared long enough to slip something into Harry's pocket with whispered instructions not to tell their mother, then disappeared again into the crowd of older students. All too soon, the conductor was calling for students to board the train. The platform erupted into a final flurry of hugs, last-minute advice, and promises to write regularly. Amelia knelt down to embrace Susan first, holding her niece tightly and breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo. "Take care of yourself," she whispered, "and take care of Harry. You're both braver than you know." Susan hugged back fiercely, and when they broke apart, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I love you, Aunt Amelia. Thank you for everything." Then it was Harry's turn, and Amelia found her throat unexpectedly tight as she wrapped her arms around the boy she had raised for 10 years. He felt both smaller and more solid than she expected, and she was struck by how much he had grown since that November night when she first brought him home. "Be careful," she said softly. "Be smart. Be kind. And remember that you are loved, no matter what happens at school, no matter what other people expect of you or say about you. You are loved for exactly who you are." Harry nodded against her shoulder, and when he pulled back, his green eyes were suspiciously bright. "I'll make you proud," he said solemnly. "You already have." The children boarded the train with their friends, waving from the windows as the last of the parents gathered on the platform. Amelia stood with the other adults, watching as the Hogwarts Express began to move, slowly at first and then with gathering speed, carrying their children away into their own lives. She stayed until the train disappeared around a bend in the tracks, taking with it the two people who had become the center of her world. The platform emptied gradually as other parents departed, until she stood alone in the suddenly quiet space, feeling the absence of Harry and Susan's chatter like a physical ache. On the train, Harry and Susan found a compartment with Ron and Neville, who was clutching his toad Trevor with the determination of someone who had already lost him twice that morning. The four of them settled in for the long journey north, watching the countryside roll past the windows as they shared sweets from the trolley and talked about what they expected from Hogwarts. "My gran says I'll probably be in Hufflepuff," Neville said quietly, scratching Trevor's head. "She says I don't have the nerve for Gryffindor like my parents did." "What's wrong with Hufflepuff?" Susan asked, bristling slightly. "They're loyal and hard-working and fair. Those are good things to be." "Nothing's wrong with it," Neville said hastily. I don't want to disappoint her. She expects me to be like my parents, and I'm not brave like they were." "You're brave enough," Harry said firmly. "You've been visiting them at St. Mungo's all these years, haven't you? That takes courage." Their conversation was interrupted when the compartment door slid open to reveal a girl with bushy brown hair and an armload of books. "Has anyone seen a toad?" she asked briskly. "A boy named Neville has lost one." "That's me," Neville said miserably. "Trevor got away again." The girl stepped into their compartment with the confident efficiency of someone accustomed to solving other people's problems. "I'm Hermione Granger," she announced, "and you're Harry Potter. I've read about you, of course, in modern magical history and the rise and fall of the dark arts and great wizarding events of the 20th century." "Oh," Harry said weakly. "Have you?" "Yes. You're quite famous, you know. I had no idea when I got my letter. I'm Muggle-born, you see. But I've learned quite a lot since then. I've memorized all our course books, naturally. Do you think that will be enough to start with?" Susan and Ron exchanged amused glances as Hermione continued to speak, clearly nervous but determined to make a good impression. Harry, meanwhile, seemed to be adjusting to yet another person who knew more about his history than he did. "I'm sure you'll do fine," Susan said kindly when Hermione paused for breath. "And we'll help you find Trevor. Won't we, Neville?" The search for the toad provided an excuse to explore the train, meeting other first-year students, and getting a sense of the social dynamics they would soon navigate at school. Harry was recognized by several students, but the confined space of the train and the excitement of the journey seemed to limit the kind of overwhelming attention he had received in Diagon Alley. As afternoon faded into evening, the train began to slow, and older students started changing into their robes. Through the windows, they caught their first glimpse of Hogwarts Castle, its towers and turrets silhouetted against the darkening sky, lights glowing warmly in hundreds of windows. "It's beautiful," Susan breathed, pressing her face to the glass. Harry nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. After 10 years of hearing about Hogwarts, of imagining what it would be like, he was finally here. The castle looked both exactly as he had pictured it, and completely different, more imposing and welcoming and magical than any description could have conveyed. As the train pulled into Hogsmeade Station, and they gathered their things to disembark, Harry thought about Amelia watching them leave from the platform that morning. She had given him everything he needed for this moment: confidence, friendships, love, and the kind of foundation that would support him through whatever challenges lay ahead. The separation was painful, but it was also right. This was his journey now, his chance to discover who he was beyond the protection of home. And as he stepped off the Hogwarts Express with his friends beside him and the castle glowing in the distance, he felt ready to begin. The boats carried them across the Black Lake toward the castle, and Harry found himself gripping the sides of his small vessel as Hogwarts loomed larger and larger before them. Nothing Amelia had told him, no amount of preparation or imagination, had prepared him for the reality of the ancient stone walls rising from the water, lights blazing from hundreds of windows like earthbound stars. "It's enormous," Susan whispered from the boat beside his, her voice filled with awe. "How does anyone find their way around?" "You get used to it," called Hagrid, the enormous man who had collected them from the train station and now led their flotilla of nervous first years across the lake. "Been here myself since I was a lad, and I still get turned around sometimes. But the castle's got a way of helping you find what you need when you need it." The boats bumped gently against a rocky shore, and they clambered out onto a stone platform that led to a massive oak door. Hagrid knocked 3 times, and the door swung open to reveal a tall, severe-looking woman in emerald green robes with greying hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Professor McGonagall," Hagrid said with obvious respect. "Here's the first years, just as you asked." "Thank you, Hagrid." Professor McGonagall's voice carried the kind of authority that made every first year automatically straighten their robes and check their appearance. Her sharp eyes swept over the group of children, pausing briefly on Harry with what might have been recognition before moving on. "Follow me, please." She led them through an entrance hall so magnificent that several students gasped aloud. The ceiling stretched so high above them that it seemed to disappear into shadow, and a marble staircase wide enough for all of them to walk abreast rose to the upper floors. They could hear hundreds of voices from behind doors to their right, the rest of the school already seated and waiting for them. Professor McGonagall brought them to a small chamber off the hall and turned to address them with the brisk efficiency of someone who had given this speech many times before. "Welcome to Hogwarts," she said. "Before you take your seats in the Great Hall, you will be sorted into your houses. While you are here, your house will be like your family. You will eat together, sleep in your house dormitories, and spend your free time in your house common room." She went on to explain the 4 houses, Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, and their founders' values, but Harry found his attention drifting to the faces around him. Ron looked excited but nervous, twisting his hands in his robes. Neville had gone pale and was clutching his toad so tightly that Trevor looked in danger of being squeezed to death. Hermione was whispering what sounded like spell incantations under her breath, apparently trying to prepare for some sort of magical test. "The sorting ceremony will begin in a few minutes," Professor McGonagall concluded. "I suggest you use this time to smarten yourselves up." She swept from the room, leaving the first years to whisper anxiously among themselves about what the sorting might involve. Harry had heard enough stories from other magical families to know it wasn't dangerous, but the uncertainty still made his stomach flutter with nervous energy. "What if it doesn't work?" he found himself asking Susan quietly. "What if the hat can't decide where I belong? Then you'll figure it out together, Susan replied with the kind of practical confidence that reminded Harry powerfully of Amelia. And no matter which house you're in, we'll still be family. Professor McGonagall returned to collect them, and they followed her in a nervous line through the enormous double doors into the Great Hall. Harry had thought the entrance hall was impressive, but the Great Hall took his breath away entirely. Thousands of candles floated overhead, illuminating 4 long tables where older students watched the new arrivals with interest and amusement. At the head of the hall, the teaching staff sat behind a high table, and directly in front of them stood a 3-legged stool with an ancient, patched wizard's hat perched on top. For a moment, the hat was perfectly still. Then it opened a wide rip near its brim like a mouth and began to sing about the 4 houses, their founders, and the qualities each valued. Harry barely heard the words, too distracted by the magnitude of what was about to happen. In minutes, he would know which house would be his home for the next 7 years. When the song ended, Professor McGonagall stepped forward with a long roll of parchment. When I call your name, you will put on the hat and sit on the stool to be sorted. She unrolled the parchment and called the first name. Abbott Hannah. A pink-faced girl with blonde pigtails stumbled forward, put on the hat, which fell right down over her eyes, and sat down. After a few moments of silence, the hat shouted, "Hufflepuff!" The table on the right exploded into cheers and applause as Hannah hurried over to join her new housemates. Harry watched the sorting continue, noting that some students were placed almost immediately, while others sat under the hat for several long minutes. Bones, Susan. Harry's stomach lurched as Susan walked forward with her head held high, the same determined expression she'd worn when facing down bullies in Diagon Alley or mastering particularly challenging spells at home. The hat settled over her ears, and Harry held his breath. It seemed like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute before the hat announced, "Hufflepuff!" Susan's face broke into a delighted grin as she pulled off the hat and practically skipped to the Hufflepuff table, where she was greeted with enthusiastic applause and welcoming hugs. She caught Harry's eye across the hall and gave him a thumbs up that made him smile despite his growing nerves. The sorting continued. Granger Hermione was quickly placed in Gryffindor, where she looked both relieved and pleased. Longbottom Neville? Took nearly 5 minutes before the hat shouted, "Gryffindor!" to Neville's obvious shock and delight. Malfoy, Draco. Harry recognized the pale boy from Madame Malkin's, who swaggered to the stool with obvious confidence. The hat barely touched his head before calling out, "Slytherin!" Draco smirked as he joined the green and silver table. Finally, Professor McGonagall called, "Potter! Harry!" The Great Hall fell silent as Harry walked to the stool. He was dimly aware of whispers following his movement. "Potter, did she say Potter?" The Harry Potter? The boy who lived? But his focus narrowed to the ancient hat waiting for him. He sat down and pulled the hat over his head, and everything went dark. Then a small voice spoke inside his skull. "Well, well," the hat said thoughtfully. "Harry Potter, I've been wondering when you'd come to sit under me. You're not quite what I expected." What did you expect? Harry thought back. Fear, perhaps. Bravado to cover insecurity. The kind of emotional turbulence that comes from a difficult childhood. The hat paused. But you're remarkably centered for someone so young. Loved, clearly. Well prepared. Confident in yourself without being arrogant about it. Most interesting. Harry waited, not sure what to say. You have courage, certainly, the hat continued. But it's not the reckless courage of someone who doesn't value his own life. It's the courage of someone who knows what's worth protecting. You have loyalty. Deep, unwavering loyalty to those you love. You have a keen mind that's been well trained to think critically. And you have ambition. though perhaps not the kind that seeks power for its own sake. "So where do I belong?" Harry asked silently. "Ah, that's the question, isn't it? You could do well in any house, Mr. Potter. But I think—" The Hat paused dramatically. "I think your heart belongs where your parents' hearts belonged, where courage and loyalty and friendship matter most. Better be Gryffindor." The last word echoed through the great hall, and Harry pulled off the hat to thunderous applause from the red and gold table. He walked toward his new housemates in something of a daze, still processing what the hat had told him about his parents. "Well done," Ron said enthusiastically, as Harry sat down beside him. "I knew you'd be in Gryffindor. Dad always said you'd probably end up here." Neville beamed at him from across the table. "We're housemates. This is brilliant." The sorting continued with Weasley Ronald joining them at Gryffindor to no one's surprise, and eventually Professor McGonagall rolled up her parchment and took her seat at the high table. Dumbledore rose from his ornate chair in the centre, his arms spread wide in welcome. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "Welcome to a new year at Hogwarts. Before we begin our banquet, I would like to say a few words, and here they are. Nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak, thank you." He sat back down, and the golden plates before them suddenly filled with food. Harry found himself laughing despite everything, charmed by the headmaster's eccentric humour. As the feast progressed, Harry became aware of the teachers watching the students from the high table. Professor McGonagall caught his eye once and nodded approvingly, which gave him a warm feeling of accomplishment. But his attention was drawn more forcefully to a teacher with greasy black hair and a hooked nose, whose dark eyes seemed to bore into Harry with an intensity that was distinctly uncomfortable. "That's Professor Snape," Percy Weasley explained, following Harry's gaze. "He teaches potions. Head of Slytherin House. He doesn't like many students, but he particularly doesn't seem to like Gryffindors." Harry studied the man who was staring at him with such obvious dislike. There was something familiar about Snape's expression, not recognition exactly, but something deeper and more complicated. When their eyes met across the hall, Snape's face twisted into what might have been disgust or pain, and he looked away abruptly. "Why is he staring at me like that?" Harry asked quietly. "Could be anything," Fred Weasley said cheerfully, leaning over from further down the table. "Maybe he's trying to read your mind. Maybe he's planning to poison your pumpkin juice. Maybe you remind him of someone he didn't like." "Fred," Percy said disapprovingly, "don't frighten the first years with nonsense." But Harry noticed that Snape continued to glance in his direction throughout the meal, and each look carried the same mixture of loathing and something else, something that might have been recognition or regret. When the feast ended and the prefects led them to their dormitories, Harry found himself looking back toward the Hufflepuff table, where Susan was chatting animatedly with her new housemates. She waved at him enthusiastically, and he waved back, feeling both grateful for her presence in the castle and oddly melancholy about their separation into different houses. "She'll be fine," Ron said, noticing his expression. "And you'll see her all the time. Meals, breaks between classes, weekends. It's not like you're on different planets." Harry nodded, knowing Ron was right, but still feeling the strange weight of this new independence. For the first time in his life, he was somewhere that Susan couldn't follow, making friends she wouldn't automatically share, facing challenges that were entirely his own. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. As they climbed the staircases to Gryffindor Tower, Harry thought about what the Sorting Hat had told him, about courage and loyalty and belonging where his parents had belonged. He was a Gryffindor now, with all the history and expectation that carried. But he was also still Harry Potter from the Bones house in Kent, raised with love and patience, and the kind of security that had given him the confidence to face whatever came next. Some identities, he realized, were inherited. Others were chosen, and the best ones perhaps were both. October at Hogwarts arrived with a crispness that reminded Harry of autumn mornings in the garden at home. But everything else about his new life felt foreign and challenging in ways he hadn't entirely expected. A month into term, he was beginning to understand that magical education involved far more than simply learning spells. It required adapting to an entirely different way of thinking about the world around him. Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration class proved to be both fascinating and frustrating. She had started them with the seemingly simple task of turning a matchstick into a needle. But after 3 weeks of attempting the transformation, Harry's matchstick remained stubbornly wooden and decidedly match-like. "Concentration, Mr. Potter," Professor McGonagall said, pausing beside his desk as he practiced the wand movement for what felt like the 100th time that morning. "Transfiguration requires absolute focus on your intention. You cannot simply wave your wand and hope for the best." "Yes, Professor," Harry replied, trying to ignore the snickers from some of his Gryffindor classmates who had managed the spell days ago. Hermione, predictably, had transfigured her matchstick on the first day, and was now working on advanced techniques that Professor McGonagall had assigned specifically for her. "Remember what we discussed about visualization," Professor McGonagall continued quietly. "You must see the needle in your mind before you can create it in reality. The magic responds to certainty, not hope." That afternoon brought potions with Professor Snape, which had quickly become Harry's least favorite class, not because of the subject matter, which was actually quite interesting, but because of Professor Snape's obvious and inexplicable dislike of him. "Potter," Snape drawled, as Harry attempted to correctly slice his beetle eyes for a boil cure potion. "Tell me, what would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry paused, his knife halfway through a beetle eye. They hadn't covered this particular combination in class, and he suspected Snape knew it. "I don't know, sir. Clearly. Fame isn't everything, is it, Potter?" Snape's dark eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "Perhaps you can tell me the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "I believe they're the same plant, sir, also called aconite." Harry's voice remained steady, though he felt heat rising in his cheeks. He had read ahead in his potions textbook, partly out of genuine interest, and partly because he wanted to be prepared for exactly this kind of questioning. Snape's expression soured further. "Correct. But don't think a little extra reading will compensate for your obvious lack of natural talent. Continue with your potion, and try not to disgrace your famous name any further." As the class progressed, Harry found himself comparing Snape's teaching style to Amelia's patient instruction at home. Where Amelia had always encouraged questions and treated mistakes as learning opportunities, Snape seemed to view every error as a personal affront and every question as evidence of stupidity. The one bright spot in Harry's academic schedule was his twice-weekly meetings with Susan in the library. Despite being in different houses, they had quickly established a routine of studying together between dinner and evening curfew, sharing notes and helping each other with particularly challenging assignments. "How was potions today?" Susan asked, as they settled at their usual table with books spread between them. "Snape hates me," Harry said simply, opening his defense against the dark arts textbook. "I don't understand why, but he definitely hates me." "Maybe he's just strict with everyone," Susan suggested, though she didn't sound convinced. "Hannah Abbott says he's awful to most Hufflepuffs, too." "It's not just strict, it's personal." Harry stared at a diagram of a boggart in his textbook, thinking about the way Snape's face twisted with what looked like genuine pain whenever he looked at Harry. Sometimes I catch him staring at me, like I remind him of something horrible." Susan reached across to squeeze his hand. "You remind him of your parents?" "Probably. Aunt Amelia said some people who survived the war have complicated feelings about what happened. Maybe Professor Snape knew them and feels guilty that he survived when they didn't." It was a thoughtful observation, and Harry filed it away as they turned their attention to charms theory and the proper wand movements for the levitation charm they would be attempting the following day. Their study session was interrupted by the arrival of the evening owl post, which brought a letter from Amelia that Harry had been eagerly awaiting. Her familiar handwriting and the faint scent of her perfume that still clung to the parchment made him unexpectedly homesick. "Dear Harry and Susan, I hope this letter finds you both well and settling into your studies. Harry, Professor McGonagall sent word that you're working hard in Transfiguration, but might benefit from additional practice with visualization techniques. I've enclosed a book that helped me when I was struggling with similar concepts as a student. Susan, your herbology professor mentioned that you have a natural aptitude for plant care and have been helping other students with their assignments. I'm proud of both of you for supporting each other and your classmates. I've been keeping busy at the ministry, but the house feels very quiet without your voices and laughter. Mrs. Clearwater asks about you constantly and insists on showing your letters to anyone who will listen. Remember that you can write to me about anything: academic struggles, social difficulties, homesickness, or simply wanting to share good news. I miss you both terribly, but I'm so proud of how well you're adapting to your new environment. All my love, Aunt Amelia P.S. Harry, I know Halloween is approaching, and I imagine you might have complicated feelings about the anniversary. Please remember that your parents would be proud of the young man you've become, and that their love lives on in the kindness you show others every day." Harry read the postscript twice, feeling a familiar tightness in his throat. He had been trying not to think about Halloween, but the approaching anniversary of his parents' death had been weighing on him more heavily as October progressed. "Are you all right?" Susan asked quietly, apparently reading his expression. "Halloween?" Harry said simply. Susan nodded, understanding. She had been there for every Halloween since Harry came to live with them, had seen how the anniversary affected him, even when he tried to hide it. "Do you want to spend it together? We could ask permission to study in an empty classroom or something, away from the celebrations." "Maybe," Harry said, grateful for her intuitive support. "I don't know how I feel about the feast yet. Everyone will be having fun, and I'll be thinking about your parents dying to save you," Susan finished softly. "But Harry, they didn't die so you could feel guilty every Halloween. They died so you could have birthdays and Christmases and Halloween feasts and all the normal happy things they wanted you to experience." Her words echoed something Amelia had told him years ago, but hearing them from Susan, who had faced her own losses, carried a different kind of weight. The Halloween feast, when it arrived, proved to be a complicated experience. The Great Hall was decorated with enormous pumpkins, live bats, and orange and black streamers that created a festive atmosphere Harry found both beautiful and painful. He sat with his Gryffindor housemates, trying to participate in their excited chatter about the decorations and special menu, but his attention kept drifting to Susan at the Hufflepuff table. She caught his eye several times throughout the meal, offering small smiles and encouraging nods that reminded him he wasn't alone in his complicated feelings. When the feast ended and students began heading back to their common rooms, she appeared at his elbow as he lingered in the entrance hall. "Want to walk around the grounds for a bit?" she suggested. "It's not too cold, and the stars are really clear tonight." They slipped outside together, grateful for the fresh air and the quiet after the noise and celebration of the feast. The grounds were peaceful, with only the distant sound of students returning to their dormitories. "I keep thinking about what they were like," Harry said, as they walked along the path toward the lake. "My parents, I mean. I have all these stories from people who knew them, but I don't have any actual memories." "But you have their love," Susan pointed out. "You might not remember them, but you remember what it feels like to be loved completely and without condition. That came from them first, before Aunt Amelia, before me. That's something no one can take away from you." Harry considered this as they sat on a bench overlooking the lake, watching the moonlight reflect off the water. "I think they would have liked Hogwarts," he said eventually. "Professor McGonagall says they were both good students. They probably sat by this same lake when they were our age. And they probably worried about the same things we worry about," Susan added. "Whether they belonged here, whether they were good enough, whether they'd make friends and figure out how to do magic properly." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts about parents, belonging, and the strange mixture of grief and gratitude that came with being loved by people who were no longer there to see the results of their sacrifice. When they finally returned to the castle, Harry felt lighter somehow, as though sharing the weight of the anniversary had made it more manageable. Halloween would always be complicated for him, but perhaps it didn't have to be something he faced alone. That night, he wrote a long letter to Amelia describing his classes, his struggles with transfiguration, his growing friendship with his roommates, and his complicated feelings about Halloween at Hogwarts. He wrote about Susan's wisdom and support, about Professor McGonagall's strict but helpful instruction, and about his determination to master the magic that his parents had died protecting. Some anniversaries, he reflected as he sealed the letter, were meant to be remembered not with sorrow, but with renewed commitment to living the life their sacrifice had made possible. As he settled into his bed in Gryffindor Tower, Harry could hear Ron snoring softly in the bed next to his, and Neville whispering to his toad in the darkness. These sounds of ordinary friendship and daily life seemed like the best possible tribute to parents who had wanted nothing more than for their son to have a chance at a normal childhood filled with friends, learning, and the kind of everyday magic that came from being loved and belonging somewhere. The letter to Amelia could wait until morning. Tonight, he would simply be grateful for the family he had, or the friends he was making, and the education that would prepare him for whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 11. 11,486 characters. November came to Hogwarts with an icy wind that rattled the ancient windows and sent leaves spiraling across the grounds in chaotic patterns that reminded Harry of his own thoughts lately. 6 weeks into term, he was beginning to understand that the hardest part of attending school away from home wasn't the coursework or the new friendships. It was the way his old life and his new life seemed to exist in parallel worlds that occasionally, jarringly, collided. The collision had happened most recently in Defense Against the Dark Arts, when Professor Quirrell had assigned them an essay on famous dark wizards of the 20th century. Harry had chosen Grindelwald, thinking it would be safer territory than writing about Voldemort, but even that had backfired when Quirrell handed back the essays with his stuttering commentary echoing through the classroom. "Mr. Potter," he had said, his voice carrying despite its tremulous quality, "your perspective on Grindelwald's defeat is quite personal. Did you perhaps have access to sources beyond our standard texts?" The question had been innocent enough, but it had made Harry's stomach clench with the familiar anxiety of being singled out for his identity rather than his work. Because, yes, he had had access to other sources. Amelia's extensive library included several first-hand accounts of the war against Grindelwald, books written by auras who had fought in those battles and lived to tell their stories. Harry had grown up reading those accounts as bedtime stories, the same way other children might read fairy tales about brave knights and wicked dragons. But how did you explain that to a classroom full of 11-year-olds without sounding like you were showing off? How did you say that your adoptive mother was one of the most senior officials in the Ministry of Magic without it feeling like you were using her position to make yourself seem more important? Harry had mumbled something about checking the library's restricted section with permission from Professor McGonagall, which was technically true, and Quirrell had moved on to the next essay. But the moment had left Harry feeling exposed in a way he was still trying to understand. It wasn't that he was embarrassed by Amelia or the life they had built together. If anything, the opposite was true. He missed home with an intensity that sometimes caught him off guard. He missed the smell of coffee brewing in their kitchen on Sunday mornings, missed the sound of Susan practicing her spells in the garden while Amelia corrected paperwork at the kitchen table. He missed the easy rhythm of conversations over dinner, the way Amelia would ask about his day and actually listen to his answer, the way Susan would steal bites from his plate when she thought he wasn't looking. But he was also beginning to realize that his normal was not everyone else's normal. When his doormates complained about their parents' letters being full of nagging reminders about homework and behavior, Harry thought about Amelia's careful, encouraging notes that arrived twice a week like clockwork. When they grumbled about being expected to help with household chores during holidays, Harry thought about the way he and Susan had always pitched in with cooking and cleaning because it was simply what families did for each other. When they talked about feeling homesick, Harry wondered if any of them understood the specific weight of missing people who had chosen to love you rather than simply being obligated to do so by blood. The realization was both comforting and isolating. Comforting because it confirmed what he had always suspected, that Amelia and Susan were extraordinary in their kindness and patience and love. Isolating because it meant that his experiences were fundamentally different from those of his classmates in ways that went beyond his fame or his scar or the whispered conversations that followed him through the corridors. "You're brooding again," Hermione observed on a particularly grey Thursday evening as they sat in the common room working on their Transfiguration homework. "You've been staring at that paragraph for 20 minutes without writing anything." Harry looked down at his parchment and realized she was right. He had been trying to explain the proper wand movement for turning a mouse into a snuff box, but his quill had remained suspended above the paper as his thoughts wandered down familiar, complicated paths. "Sorry," he said, dipping his quill in fresh ink. "Just thinking." "About home?" Hermione's voice was gentler than usual, tinged with the kind of understanding that came from her own struggles with feeling different from their classmates. "About fitting in," Harry corrected, though the two were so closely related as to be nearly the same thing. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing it wrong. Being here, I mean. Everyone else seems to know how to be a normal student." Ron looked up from his own essay, a chocolate frog card bookmark sliding out from between his pages. "Mate, if you think any of us are normal, you haven't been paying attention. Dean's obsessed with those football posters he stuck up everywhere. Seamus keeps trying to turn everything into explosions, and Neville talks to his plants. Normal is overrated." It was a kind thing to say, delivered with the casual warmth that made Ron such an easy friend, despite the occasional moment of thoughtless insensitivity. But it missed the point in a way that Harry couldn't quite figure out how to explain without sounding ungrateful or self-important. The truth was that Harry didn't want to be normal. He wanted to be exactly who he was, Harry Potter from the Bones house in Kent, raised with love and structure and the kind of security that came from knowing you were valued for yourself rather than your usefulness. He wanted to be the boy who had learned to cook eggs properly by standing on a step stool beside Amelia. The boy who had spent hours helping Susan practice defensive spells in their garden. The boy who had never doubted that he was wanted and welcomed in the space he occupied. But he was also beginning to understand that being that person at Hogwarts required a kind of translation between worlds that was more exhausting than he had anticipated. It meant downplaying the extent of his magical education so his classmates wouldn't feel inadequate. It meant not mentioning the books he had read or the conversations he had overheard about ministry politics. It meant pretending that the idea of writing to his guardian for advice or comfort was unusual rather than the natural response of a child who trusted the adults in his life to care about his well-being. Most of all, it meant navigating the complex social dynamics of being famous for surviving something terrible, while also being grateful for the life that tragedy had ultimately given him. Because how did you explain to people that you missed your birth parents, but didn't spend time wishing they were still alive to raise you? How did you say that your mother's death had led to your adoption by someone who was, in many ways, exactly the parent you needed, without sounding callous about the loss itself? These were the thoughts that kept Harry awake at night in his four-poster bed, listening to the soft breathing of his doormates and trying to sort through feelings that seemed too large and complicated for an 11-year-old to manage on his own. In those quiet hours, he found himself missing Amelia's patient wisdom more than anything else. She had always been able to help him untangle his more complex emotions, asking the right questions to guide him toward his own understanding, rather than simply telling him how he should feel. The next morning brought a letter from Susan, delivered by a tawny owl that Harry didn't recognize. Her handwriting was more hurried than usual, and the content made his stomach twist with homesickness and worry. Harry, Aunt Amelia has been working late every night this week on something to do with escaped Death Eater sightings near Portsmouth. She won't tell me what exactly, but she's been doing that thing where she checks all the wards twice before bed and makes sure there's tea ready for when the auras stop by for emergency meetings. I think she's worried about something bigger than she's letting on. I've been helping as much as I can, making sure she eats dinner and remembering to take her coffee up to her office when she gets too absorbed in case files to come downstairs. But I miss having you here to help me take care of her properly. She listens to you in a way she doesn't always listen to me, especially when it comes to things like taking breaks and getting enough sleep. How are you doing with everything? Your last letter sounded a bit homesick. If you need to come home for a weekend, I'm sure Aunt Amelia would arrange it. The ministry has emergency protocols for student safety, and she's never hesitated to use them when it comes to our well-being. Write back soon. And don't worry too much about fitting in at school. You've always been exactly the right person for our family, and that's not going to change just because you're sleeping somewhere else for a few months. Love, Susan P.S. Archimedes misses you. He keeps flying to your bedroom window and looking confused when you don't open it. The letter settled something in Harry's chest that he hadn't realized was twisted up with anxiety. Susan's matter-of-fact affection and her assumption that he would want to help take care of Amelia reminded him of something fundamental that he had been in danger of forgetting. His identity wasn't contingent on his classmates' understanding or approval. He was part of a family that had been carefully, deliberately built over the course of 10 years. That foundation didn't disappear just because he was temporarily living somewhere else. More than that, the letter reminded him that being different from his classmates wasn't necessarily a problem to be solved. Susan was right. He had always been exactly the right person for their family. The qualities that made him feel out of place at Hogwarts were the same qualities that had allowed him to thrive in the Bones household: his thoughtfulness, his sense of responsibility, his deep capacity for loyalty and care. Perhaps the solution wasn't to become more like everyone else. Perhaps it was to trust that the right friendships would develop with people who appreciated those qualities, rather than requiring him to hide them. That evening, Harry wrote back to Susan with a lighter heart than he had felt in weeks. He told her about his defense against the dark arts essay and his concerns about standing out for the wrong reasons. He asked her to give Amelia his love and to remind her that taking care of herself was part of taking care of the people who depended on her. He described his dorm-mates and his classes and the strange magic of living in a castle full of teenagers who were all trying to figure out how to be the people they were meant to become. Most importantly, he told her that he was grateful for the reminder that home was not a place he had left behind, but a set of relationships that traveled with him wherever he went. Some identities were inherited, he wrote, remembering his sorting night revelation. Others were chosen, but the best ones were built slowly, with patience and love and the kind of daily care that turned strangers into family. As he sealed the letter and prepared it for Hedwig's next flight home, Harry felt the familiar settling sensation that came with remembering who he really was, beneath all the noise and confusion of trying to belong somewhere new. He was Harry Potter, raised with love by Amelia Bones and Susan Bones. That was true whether he was at Hogwarts or at home, whether his classmates understood his background or not, whether he managed to fit in perfectly or remained slightly apart. Some foundations, once built properly, were strong enough to support you no matter how far you traveled from home. Chapter 12. 11,847 characters. December arrived at Hogwarts with the kind of dramatic snowfall that transformed the castle into something from a fairy tale, all gleaming towers and frosted windows that caught the light like scattered diamonds. Harry should have been entirely enchanted by the beauty of his first winter at school, but instead he found himself standing at the window of the common room on the last day of term before holidays, watching his classmates' excited preparations for home with a mixture of anticipation and unexpected sadness. The sadness surprised him. He had been looking forward to Christmas at home for weeks, counting down the days until he could fall back into the comfortable routines of life with Amelia and Susan. He missed everything about their December traditions, the way Amelia would let them stay up late, decorating the tree while she made mulled wine and told stories about Christmases past, the way Susan insisted on making elaborate gingerbread houses that inevitably collapsed but tasted wonderful anyway, the way they would all pile onto the sofa Christmas morning to open presents in order of age, youngest to oldest, with hot chocolate and far too much bacon. But he was also discovering that leaving Hogwarts felt more difficult than he had expected. Somewhere over the past 4 months, this strange castle full of moving staircases and talking portraits had become a second home, and his housemates had become something approaching family. The thought of being away from them for 2 weeks felt oddly hollow, as though he were being asked to choose between 2 different versions of himself. "You look like someone stole your Christmas pudding," Hermione observed, settling into the chair beside him with a stack of books that she was apparently planning to take home for light holiday reading. Her own trunk sat nearby, neatly packed and labelled with the kind of organizational precision that Harry had come to associate with her approach to everything. "Just thinking about going home," Harry replied, which was true, but incomplete. "How did you explain that you were excited and homesick and guilty about feeling anything less than perfectly happy all at the same time?" "I'm nervous about going home," Hermione admitted quietly. "My parents are so excited to hear about everything, but I'm not sure how to explain All of this. She gestured around the common room, where Fred and George Weasley were currently charming paper airplanes to dive-bomb unsuspecting first years, while Lee Jordan provided commentary like a Quidditch announcer. They know about magic now, obviously, but understanding it and living it are different things. Harry nodded, recognizing something familiar in her concern. It's hard when the people you love exist in a different world than the one you're learning to navigate. Exactly. Hermione looked relieved to be understood. I keep worrying that I'll sound like I'm showing off, or that I'll accidentally make them feel excluded from something that's become such a big part of my life. It was a generous thing to worry about, Harry thought, and utterly typical of Hermione's tendency to consider other people's feelings even when she was wrestling with her own complicated emotions. It was also exactly the kind of problem that Amelia would know how to help with, the delicate balance of honoring where you came from while embracing where you were going. Amelia always tells Susan and me that love isn't about keeping your world separate, Harry said slowly, working through the advice as he spoke. It's about finding ways to let the people who matter most see who you're becoming, even if they can't follow you into every part of your new life. Hermione considered this with the serious attention she brought to all worthwhile ideas. That's very wise, she said eventually. Your aunt sounds like a remarkable woman. She is, Harry agreed, and felt the familiar warmth that came with talking about his family to someone who genuinely wanted to understand them. She taught me that you don't have to choose between loving the people who raised you and becoming the person you're meant to be. They can support each other if you're willing to do the work of helping them fit together. It was a conversation that stayed with Harry through the final day of classes and the flurry of packing that followed. As he folded his school robes and arranged his textbooks in his trunk, he found himself thinking about the ways his two worlds had been quietly influencing each other all term. He wrote letters home that were full of Hogwarts details, but he also found himself approaching his schoolwork with the methodical patience Amelia had taught him, and standing up to bullying behavior the way Susan had always encouraged him to do. More than that, he was beginning to understand that the security of being loved by Amelia and Susan had given him something invaluable at Hogwarts, the confidence to be genuinely himself rather than whoever he thought other people wanted him to be. He didn't need to downplay his intelligence to make other students comfortable or exaggerate his importance to impress anyone. He could simply be Harry, thoughtful, curious, fiercely loyal, and occasionally homesick, and trust that the right friendships would develop around that authentic foundation. The train ride home was everything Harry remembered, and more. The familiar rhythm of wheels on tracks, the excited chatter of students comparing holiday plans, the gradual shift from the wild Scottish landscape to the gentler countryside of southern England. He shared a compartment with Hermione and Neville, both of whom were quiet with their own anticipations and anxieties about returning to families who loved them but lived in different worlds. "Do you think," Neville asked, as they passed through a station whose name Harry didn't catch, "that we'll be different when we come back? Different enough that people notice, I mean." It was a question Harry had been wondering about himself. 4 months felt like both a lifetime and no time at all. He felt fundamentally the same. Still the boy who preferred reading to Quidditch, still someone who worried about other people's feelings, still young enough to miss his family when he was away from them for too long. But he also felt more confident in ways that were hard to define, more certain about his own opinions, and less apologetic about taking up space in the world. "I think," Harry said carefully, "that the people who love us properly will notice that we've grown, but they won't be surprised by who we're becoming. If we're becoming the right version of ourselves, It should feel like a continuation of who we already were, not a completely different person. It was the kind of answer Amelia might have given, and Harry felt a flutter of pride at managing to articulate something he was still working through himself. The conversation settled into comfortable quiet after that, each of them lost in their own thoughts as familiar landmarks began to appear outside the windows. King's Cross was organized chaos, full of students hugging goodbye, and parents calling instructions, and trunks being wrestled onto trolleys. Harry spotted Amelia before she saw him, and the sight of her calm, capable figure, waiting patiently near the barrier, made something tight in his chest finally relax completely. She looked exactly the same. Professional robes, practical boots, the kind of alert posture that came from years of aura training. But when she caught sight of him emerging from the crowd, her entire face lit up with the kind of unguarded joy that was reserved for the people she loved most in the world. "Harry," she said, and her voice carried all the warmth and relief and simple happiness that Harry had been missing without quite realizing how much. Her hug was firm and reassuring, and exactly the right duration, neither too brief nor so long as to embarrass him in front of his classmates. "I missed you," Harry said into her shoulder, allowing himself to sound as young as he felt in that moment. "I missed you too," Amelia replied, pulling back to look at him with the kind of careful attention that meant she was checking to make sure he was truly all right. "You look well. Taller, I think, and more confident. Hogwarts suits you." It was exactly the right thing to say. Acknowledgement that he had grown without any suggestion that he had become someone unfamiliar or unwelcome. Harry felt the last of his anxiety about bridging his two worlds dissolve completely. "Where's Susan?" he asked, looking around for his sister. "At home, making what she claims will be the most spectacular welcome-home dinner in the history of welcome-home dinners," Amelia said, with the fond exasperation that was her standard response to Susan's more ambitious domestic projects. "She's been planning the menu since your last letter. I believe there may be 3 different types of potatoes involved." Harry laughed, a sound full of genuine delight and the kind of anticipation that came from knowing you were about to be exactly where you belonged. "That sounds perfect." The drive home was filled with easy conversation, Harry telling Amelia about his classes and his friends, Amelia sharing carefully edited news about her work, and Susan's latest adventures in advanced charms practice. It felt like slipping back into a favorite piece of clothing, comfortable and familiar, and exactly the right fit. When they pulled into the driveway of the house in Kent, Harry saw Susan's face appear at the kitchen window, before disappearing immediately, presumably to put final touches on whatever elaborate feast she had prepared. The garden looked smaller than Harry remembered, but more precious somehow, every detail sharp with the kind of significance that came from temporary absence. "Welcome home," Amelia said softly, as they sat in the car for a moment, both of them looking at the house where they had built their unconventional family, one ordinary day at a time. "Thank you," Harry replied, and meant it for everything, for the welcome, for the home itself, for the choice she had made 11 years ago to take in an orphaned baby and love him into the person he was becoming. Susan met them at the door with flour in her hair and an apron that proclaimed her the chief executive of culinary excellence, and Harry thought that no amount of magic at Hogwarts could compare to the simple enchantment of being exactly where he was supposed to be, surrounded by people who had chosen to love him and whom he had chosen to love in return. That evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, sharing Susan's admittedly spectacular dinner and catching up on 4 months of accumulated news and stories, Harry felt the pieces of his world settle back into their proper configuration. Hogwarts had taught him spells and shown him wonders and given him friendships he would treasure for the rest of his life. but home had taught him who he was beneath all the external noise and confusion, and that knowledge would travel with him wherever he went. Some kinds of magic, Harry reflected, as he helped Susan with the washing up while Amelia corrected case files at the kitchen table, were too fundamental to be taught in any classroom. They had to be learned through daily practice, through the accumulated weight of small kindnesses and shared routines and the patient work of building trust one interaction at a time. He was Harry Potter, the boy who lived, heir to a complicated legacy and destined for challenges he couldn't yet imagine. But he was also, more fundamentally, Harry Bones, son, brother, student, and beloved member of a family that had been deliberately chosen and carefully tended until it was strong enough to support whatever storms lay ahead. As he settled into his own bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of home settling around him, Harry smiled into the darkness and let himself feel perfectly, completely satisfied with both versions of his identity. Tomorrow he would start thinking about returning to Hogwarts for the spring term, about maintaining his friendships and continuing his education, and navigating the ongoing complexities of growing up in the magical world. Tonight, he was simply home, surrounded